Have you noticed when you read an old book and compare it to a new one, the fairy tales in it usually change? The same thing happens to mythical creatures. Just like how in The Little Mermaid, the mermaid actually turns into sea foam and the prince marries someone else. It happens to mythical creatures too, the stories change. I have always been a fan of fairy tales and all that stuff. So one thing led to another, and I find a book in the library that's titled The Fairy Encyclopedia, and I read through it, and I find things really weird because things that I would consider ghosts, like banshees, are in it. And then there's the fairy, I think it's called, I can't remember the name, but it is a creature that is so hideous, it cries, and it warns others of its hideousness by its crying and leads them back into the mainland because it's not safe in the forest. But you don't really hear about those fairy tales, so I like them a lot. So, and things really different change, so let's get to the changes. The first changes that are like really big and really obvious are like the sirens. When you think of sirens, you think of half woman, half fish people with beautiful voices that lure sirens to their death by drowning them and having them jump overboard. But back in the day, according to Ancient History Encyclopedia, the sirens are a half woman, half bird with sometimes arms, but not always. They had a beautiful singing voice, and they would lure sailors to drive their ship into rocks, and therefore they would drown. The next one is unicorn. When you think of unicorn, you think of glitter, you think of sparkles, you think of rainbows. But back in the day, according to Mythical Creatures and Fabulous Sources book and resource guide, edited by Malcolm South, a unicorn is a creature with a horn that is horse-like, goat-like, or some other creature-like that can only be tamed by a virgin. And the next one is the Fae. Fae have gone, the biggest change in my mind when you think of fairy, you think of like a tiny little person with wings. But back in the day, they were a gigantic category of mythical and crazy creatures, from a swamp horse that would drown you, Kelpie, to tiny little men that would fix your shoe, a brownie. So before we can get into why they changed, we need to get into why we had them in the first place. We had them in the first place because we needed explanations for things, like your child getting really, really sick and dying. Well, it's hard to cope with, so that's not your baby. That is Changeling, which is a fairy disguised as your child. An example of this is in the fairy and folk tales of the Irish peasantry, in the story of the Brewing the Eggshells. A lady's baby is taken by a fairy, and she knows this because her happy little blue-eyed child went from happy and smiling to crying and shriveled. Also, if someone gets lost in the woods and you never see them again, well, of course, they aren't dead and lost in the woods. No, they were taken by the fairies. Someone goes missing by a swamp, wasn't the alligators, it was the Kelpie. They were used as ways to explaining why things happened, and also scapegoats and coping mechanisms. They were also used as warnings and lessons. If you don't want your child to lie, just tell them a story about a fairy that will eat your toes of lying children. And if you don't want a child to go near a swamp, just tell them about the swamp horse that will drown them. They're not gonna mess with the swamp horse. So let's get into why they did change. Let's start with the sirens because it was the first one. Sirens changed because they're so close to mermaids. They're both half person, half animal. They both have ties to the sea, and they both have really nice singing voices. So it was understandable that the two got mixed. Mermaids were more popular because of The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. That's the name, I think. Next is unicorns. Back in the day, unicorns were all about purity and all that stuff. but they were always tied with young girls because they were the only ones that could tame them. So as young girls' interests changed, the unicorn changed to mate them because they were always tied together. So, well, young girls like colors and rainbows, unicorns become colors and rainbows. The Fae, it's not really known, but it's guessed that because of fairy tales, their image changed greatly because, in Cinderella, the fairy godmother helps her, and other stories like that really help to change the image of the fairies. So, yes. So what can we learn from this? Well, change is good and bad. To fit the time, it's good. But we also lose some creativity. Like, I would love to have a brownie write my speech for a cup of cream, and who knows, maybe one is, and I'm just reading the script he has given me. But I'm glad to know that I have a reason to stay away from the swamp. Isn't a magical swamp horse that will drown me, but is in fact the gators that I should be afraid of. So it is good to have both imagination and creativity, but we should also keep warnings and stuff. But hey, we still have them around. My parents told me stories of creatures that would punish naughty children for lying, so the end.